Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan and welcome once again to the magnificent but dangerous comic book vault. Today we're taking a look at Uncanny X-Men Sisterhood, a trade of Uncanny X-Men comics from 2009 collecting numbers 508 to 512, written by Matt Fraction with art by Greg Land. This is an interesting read for me because it informs a lot of things that I'm reading currently and X-Men stuff that I've read over the last couple of years, and it was kind of nice to read this to fill in some gaps and explain some things for me that I just didn't know already. This was a period of X-Men that I had read about just through current stuff, mentioning the status quo around Utopia and around just after Scarlet Witch destroyed most of the mutant population through her quick, angry, psychic blast thing, and I had not really read anything from this period. I started reading regular New X-Men around Schism, and then I read Kieran Gillen, I think it was Kieran Gillen who did some Uncanny X-Men right after that, and I really liked that stuff, and then I've been reading Bendis ever since Marvel Now started, so I'm hip deep in the middle of most of the X-books right now, but this stuff honestly had me a little bit lost. So I will talk about this as best I can with the context that I have, but naturally I've not taken the time to go back and read a lot of stuff from right before this and right after this. So this is certainly informed by all kinds of stuff naturally. I mean, X-Men is always an ongoing soap opera, so to read any X-Men book without having read everything that came before is always going to be, in a way, somewhat of an incomplete review, just because this is always an ongoing story, constantly compounded by everything that's come before it, collaborative effort by all these different writers and artists building on what came before. What we've got going on here is the X-Men are living in a place now where they're, in a way, kind of happier than they've ever been. There are just a lot fewer of them, so at least relatively, because of what happened with Scarlet Witch. So they live in this town now where most of the humans accept them, and it's this very progressive, kind of accepting kind of community, and things are going really well. So naturally, the proverbial stuff is hitting the fan now, and we've got a Sisterhood run by Madeline Pryor, who I knew absolutely nothing about prior to this, and she apparently was a former wife of Cyclops who has gone bad. So you've got this Sisterhood, kind of like Magneto's Brotherhood, and there are a lot of parallels that I kind of appreciated, where it's kind of an evil sisterhood, and they're out for power and dominance, just like Magneto is, and they're kind of making the case of humans who hate and fear mutants for them. And in this case, they're doing that by trying to resurrect a mutant who is powerful enough to hold Madeline Pryor's entity, and she is going after Jean Grey. So at the beginning of this, there is another entity that she puts in the body of the recently deceased, I think recently deceased Psylocke. So she decides that she's going to be able to transfer her mind into the body of, into a reconstituted body of Jean Grey, and have all of the super mega scary powers of Jean Grey. And there's a little bit of Phoenix iconography here and there, which kind of begs the question as to whether or not you would get the Phoenix if you resurrected Jean Grey, which doesn't really make any sense, because if that were to work, because the Phoenix was a spatial entity as far as I understand it, and so if you resurrected Jean Grey, yeah, you'd get something powerful enough that was able to hold the Phoenix, but there are a couple of panels in here that almost, and unless it's just, we always think about the Phoenix when we think of Jean Grey, and Greg Land thought it would be fun to get to draw the Phoenix again. There are a couple places in here where I found myself wondering if Matt Fraction and Greg Land thought that somehow or other you'd get the Phoenix if you resurrected Jean Grey, and if maybe Madeline Pryor thinks that for some reason. But anyway, I don't know. So the main crux of the narrative is the X-Men trying to stop Madeline Pryor and the Sisterhood from attaining this goal. Meanwhile, in the background, the somewhat more interesting, in my opinion, kind of B story, which I'm sure will become the A story more and more as this progresses, and this is still going on in the background at the time of this. You've got Trask, Simon Trask, trying to pass legislation that would make it unlawful for mutants to procreate, and this is where the it seems too good to be true stuff is going on with how happy the X-Men are right now and how well things seem to be going for mutant kind, especially because there are so few of them. Now there's even more of a chance of possible extinction, as there is legislation that Trask is trying to pass so that mutants won't be able to have children. And his argument for this, and certainly, I mean, I'm sure he has even more of an agenda, but his argument on his platform anyway is, if we let mutants procreate, then we might cause we might cause the extinction of humanity, because there was an explosion that had something to do with mutant powers. I don't know all the details, that that caused a whole lot of deaths, and he's saying that mutants are dangerous simply by virtue of existing. And while he has a little bit of a point that there are certainly all kinds of mutant powers that, if left unchecked and they cannot control, and somebody like Xavier isn't able to help them learn how to control it, that's what X3 was all about, then it doesn't matter that they're a person, they're also a living weapon that no one's able to control. And what would be better, allowing them to exist simply because they have the right to, or making sure that you don't cause the extinction of the human race? And it's one of those kind of ends justify the means things. Would we, if like everybody died except for one person because mutants existed, would that one person look back and wish that somehow or rather that legislation had worked, or that something could have solved it? On the other hand, these are, of course, sentient beings, and if you take away liberties like being able to control your own procreation, where does the line get drawn? And of course, that's scary enough, but obviously some characters even start talking about, well, if they can do that, then when do the concentration camps start to happen? Kind of interesting now that fast forward several years into present day comics, and we're right in the middle of the big event Axis with Red Skull, and he has actually done that. He's created concentration camps, and he is Xavier's worst fears realized. And so this is kind of somewhat of a precursor to that. Not that that's a direct result of anything happening in this, but those ideas are being talked about, and I think it's kind of interesting that I'm reviewing this while I'm in the middle of reading a book that is actually all about that nightmare scenario. What Beast and the kind of science team of the X-Men are trying to do, and by the way, I appreciate that there are humans involved there. We do have a lot of humans in this that are trying to help mutants, and I really like that. It's not like humans versus the mutants. It's certainly more complicated than that. It's not black and white. But you've got Beast and the science team who want to go back in time and find the first modern mutant. They address the fact that there are mutants from even before the beginning of the 20th century, but that somewhere around circa 1900, mutants, the modern set of mutants first started being born, and he wants to go back and find out everything he can about their about the earliest mutants' blood and what exactly it is that that allows mutants to be mutants and can keep their mutant gene going. Because ever since what happened with Scarlet Witch, mutants haven't been able to procreate. So we've got legislation being passed about it, but they can't procreate and have mutants with the gene. It's dormant. They can't figure out how to jumpstart it. And so Beast is thinking that if he goes back in time and takes a look at that early blood, he might be able to see what the differences are and fix the problem. Well, the reason that all that is going on is because, and the reason that the legislation is going through, or is being talked about, is because there mysteriously has been one mutant birth now. And the big question is, how in the world did that happen? And that's what Beast is going back to try and figure out. Obviously, much of that is not resolved yet by the end of this, especially that legislation. That was the big thing that I was really interested in. I really like that we've got both humans and mutants trying to play God here. We're seeing all sides of this. We're seeing the good mutants trying to keep their race alive, trying to keep themselves from going extinct. There is a pretty good case in this for mutants as the next evolution of humanity, as opposed to mutants just being another subset of humanity. There have been stories that I've read where I didn't completely understand why mutants see themselves as another race, considering that a lot of the time what will happen is you'll have a mutant that will not be able to use their powers anymore. They'll lose the gene, or it goes dormant or something, and then it's talked about as if they are now a different species. And sometimes I don't get that. Here, I found myself actually kind of appreciating that idea more and seeing them more as this other species, or at the very least, not that like they are psychologically or anything, of course, they're still human beings, but the idea being that it could be a lot worse for the future of mankind if there are no mutants, because naturally this seems like what was supposed to happen, that like natural selection, evolution, all of that is leading to this. So if we do something artificial to stop it, what happens to human beings? The mutant race is actually the next step and is in a way superior, but not superior to the point that human beings shouldn't be allowed to exist, but simply that we have to find a way to coexist. This is the good X-Men side of it, of course, Xavier, and what Xavier's side would have been. The idea that if you put if humans and mutants are able to live peacefully, then all of that simply happens naturally, however that's supposed to happen. Maybe eventually you just, everybody that's born is a mutant. Should human beings consider that the destruction of their species, if we're going to look at them as two different species? I suppose as long as we could control our powers, certainly we would all enjoy having superpowers, so what exactly would be wrong with that? And so then, but all of those questions I think are really interesting. And then on the other side, you have mutants, of course, that, as illustrated with the Sisterhood here, that see themselves as superior to human beings. And so they, just like the worst of humanity, are trying to play God in order to make that happen. So they are forcing things that are unnatural, or at the very least irresponsible, and really bad for the natural freedoms of everybody. So you've got on one side humans trying to pass a law to play God, to control mutants, essentially eugenics, and control mutants' ability to procreate. And then on the other side, you've got mutants who are playing God in trying to resurrect bodies in order to live forever. So a lot of that's not, unfortunately, in this brought enough to the forefront for my taste, but again, I feel like I'm reading a sample of a much larger story here, so I can't give it too much. I can't begrudge it too much for that, certainly. It did get me wanting to read on a little bit. It's Greg Land art. And Greg Land is somewhat notorious for tracing, and specifically for tracing pornography. And I could see a lot of that kind of thing in this book. The big intrusive thing in this is that for a story that seems to really be thrusting things forward for the main flagship X-Men book, the important things going on in the X-Men narrative, all the stuff about the X-Men trying to survive, and that legislation that's trying to be passed, and the possibility of resurrecting Jean Grey, which of course Cyclops and Wolverine managed to stop. But all that seems like a really important story. I kind of picked this up and expected, especially reading the first issue of this, that this would all be kind of throwaway, and it was just sort of a excuse to get as many female X-Men characters all in a book as humanly possible. And it's not entirely that. What's going on here seems incredibly significant. And yet, there is a really distracting thing all the way through it, up until the last issue, which is not drawn by Greg Land. That's drawn by Yannick Paquette, which it was an appropriate shift, by the way, because it's Beast and some other characters back in the 1900s doing that time travel field trip that I was talking about, and when they do that, it's drawn in this other kind of more pencil-y style, and it just seemed really appropriate for that time period. But anyway, up until then, Fraction has a tendency, and I don't know how much of this is him and how much of this is Land asking him for excuses to draw certain things, but there's a bunch of places where Fraction kind of contrives a reason for Land to draw a really kind of juvenile male fantasy revolving around really attractive women. And here's the thing. People look at Greg Land's art and they say it's over-sexualized, it's kind of demeaning to women, that kind of thing. I don't mind art that kind of portrays men or women in this kind of as specimens of the species, you know, where like a lot of again, both men and women are just like gorgeous people. It can be a stylistic choice. I don't really have a problem with let somebody draw like the prettiest or gorgeous or hottest women that he can, if that's what he likes to do, and especially if it somehow serves the story. But even if it doesn't, if that's just how the women look, I don't really have a problem with that. What bugs me is when there are excuses to make it sexualized and the story itself doesn't warrant anything explicit or any kind of overt sexualization. If you're gonna have that stuff, at least let it be relevant to the story. You've got a place where Emma Frost is in this really over-the-top kind of bondage scenario, and it didn't really feel like it was warranted to go that far. It really kind of felt like somebody's fantasy being played out. And then there's this other scene where Elixir is going through this kind of Zen routine with the Stepford sisters, and it's just totally random and kind of pointless, and it's him telling them about, like taking them through this routine and talking about sex therapy and making it really hot in that room on purpose, to the point where one of the sisters says, we might have to take our clothes off, like all of our clothes off. Oh, but if it gets too hot, we'll be naked, but we suppose we might be willing to do anything for the sake of enlightenment. And all of that struck me as really kind of gratuitous. It's sort of like sometimes the music in a musical or the action in an action movie, where it's gotta serve the story. If the point of this is to draw a lot of really attractive women and to put them in like scenarios where we want them to look like pinups, and there's a lot of places like that too, where, especially like with Psylocke, there's a moment where the good Psylocke, there's like a good Psylocke and a bad Psylocke, and they put the bad Psylocke in the good Psylocke's body, and then she eventually kind of takes control back, and it's an excuse to resurrect her and get Psylocke back in this. And anyway, when the good Psylocke finally gets her control back, she poses like there's a camera there or something, and really looks like she's doing this kind of pinup pose. And I don't know, that stuff sometimes was kind of intrusive to me. This story seems to be about getting as many female characters in as humanly possible. I mean, nearly everybody's in this. I mean, pretty much everybody but Jubilee seems to be here. Dazzler is in this, Emma Frost, and Storm, and Kitty Pryde. I mean, you name it, nearly everybody is in this. And it's not really a story about gender roles or anything about like like female versus male psychology or anything like that. There is certainly the thing with Cyclops' dead wives, but that is never brought enough to the forefront, and that's something that I was kind of missing in this, and wonder if it's handled in any way and tackled later, that you've got Wolverine and Cyclops kind of at odds, as they nearly always are, because, of course, they both loved Jean Grey, and Wolverine had a lock of Jean Grey's hair that the sisters go in and break in to their home in order to steal. That was a thing I never understood in this, by the way, and if somebody's read this and can shed some light on this, I'd really appreciate it. I didn't really understand why the sisters needed a lock of Jean Grey's hair and then were going to go resurrect her body. I didn't really understand why they needed the hair. Maybe they, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe they didn't know where she was. I think maybe that's what it was. They didn't know where she was buried, and somehow having the hair maybe helped them track down the gravestone or something. I'm not sure what the deal was there. But anyway, so there's friction between them there because of that, and there's this idea that Cyclops dates psychics because he's trying to get as close to getting back to Jean Grey as possible, and that there's something kind of sad and messed up about that, and that maybe he's kind of using women a little bit, and that the women that he gets with don't really, besides Jean Grey, don't really love him, and that they're kind of preying on that, and they can use that, and that's why he keeps getting with women who either were supervillains or end up becoming supervillains, that kind of stuff. And I liked all that, but it's a fraction of what's here. I mean, it's kind of mentioned and dropped, and like I said, more of what I latched onto as far as prevailing themes in this, more of what I kind of latched onto was the idea of playing God and your very classic X-Men ideas of the only way that humans and mutants can get along is if they stop trying to dominate each other and figure out a way to work together. The deal with Beast trying to go back in time I thought was really cool, partly because, as I said, this was a big thing, kind of the big thing that informed Current for me, that Beast already had this flirtation with time travel, and that he's not as responsible about science as maybe he should be because he gets so giddy about it, and he sees it as something he can control. And again, that kind of puts him accidentally in that same place as some of the bad guys who misuse their powers and misuse science, except that he doesn't have any kind of sinister goal behind it. It's simply hubris and arrogance. But he gets so giddy about going back in time in this, and does not understand why other people that are with him aren't more excited about it and treating it like this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, like he is, like this big, amazing, kind of cosmic field trip. And so I really liked getting to see that he had done that before, because this really informs his decision to go back and get the original 5 X-Men in Bendis' run. It's almost like Hank's answer to everything is time travel. That bit got kind of weird because they go back in time, like I said, to get that blood sample, and they end up stopping the first Sentinel, and there's a Sentinel that is like steam powered, and while it was kind of fun to see like a steampunkish kind of Sentinel, I don't understand why, especially back then and before any mutants have even been born yet. This is in anticipation of them with the Hellfire Club and with Sebastian Shaw. I found myself thinking, why is the answer always giant robots? And I think that a lot. I'm like, why is the answer to beating mutants always giant robots? And even like before a lot of robots had really been thought of, and that it really made a lot of sense to build them, the technology really isn't there. Already, giant robots. It also seemed like a huge coincidence that they would go back in time and they would have to have been there in order to stop this from happening, or all of time would have been totally different and we might not have ever had mutants at all. And it seems to be the kind of time travel where that's the way it always was. That's at least the way it seemed to me. And that if they had always gone back in time, and that if they didn't go back in time, we'd have an entirely different history, and there would be no X-Men. And there is discussion about how coincidental it is. And so, again, that's a thing that I imagine maybe down the road after this is explained as to how in the world they got that lucky that they just happened to be there at the right time, in the right place, in the right day. And it seemed a little bit like kind of a Doctor Who scenario where it's like you show up and you're just and you're there for one thing that seems a lot smaller and less important, and then all of a sudden you're saving the entire universe, and if you hadn't been there, the universe would be totally different or destroyed or something. But anyway, overall, this is not a bad read. I'm glad I read it, as I said, to inform current stuff. Some intrusive over-sexualization stuff, certainly. And with this many characters, it often runs the risk of losing me because it's not focusing on any one person or even a small group long enough. There are a lot of places where I kind of just feel like I'm watching a bunch of stuff happening and not really with characters as much as I'd like to be. It's a difficult thing sometimes with juggling a lot of characters in an ensemble piece. This manages it sometimes and has a tough time with it other times. But anyway, that is my review of Uncanny X-Men Sisterhood, and now let's spin the wheel and find out what I'll be tackling next time. And now replacing today's book on the wheel is The Death of Wolverine, so let's spin it and find out what we got going on next time. Alright, next time we'll be tackling Superman, the Last Family of Krypton. This was a three-part, I think, miniseries published in late 2010, and it was an Elseworld story in which, instead of just Kal-El coming to Earth, all of the El family came to Earth, his parents as well, and I remember really enjoying this one and have been wanting to review it for a long time, so I'm really looking forward to that. Thanks everybody so much for watching. If you would like to send anything for review to put on the big wheel for the Comic Vault, you can always send things to our P.O. Box. That's Geekvolution, P.O. Box 4733, Overland Park, Kansas 66204. And in the meantime, thanks again. I am Captain Logan, and happy reading.